Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Anna, and I'd like to say a very, very warm welcome to everyone here. If you still haven't got a seat, there's some at the front. You can be brave and grab one. We are Warwick Christian Union, and we exist as a society to give every student on campus a chance to hear and respond to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Welcome to Wonder. We're very excited to have you here. For this event, we are going to have a talk on humanity and divinity in the Renaissance. And then afterwards, there'll be a chance for you guys to ask questions of the speaker in a Q&A. So we're very excited that our speaker today is David Lines. He did his PhD at Harvard University, and he's now a professor at this university and director for the Center of Renaissance Studies. So if you could give him a very warm welcome to the stage, that would be amazing.
Does this work? Yes? Okay. So welcome, everyone. Could we have the first slide, please? And after that? Fantastic. So we need to start today from a foundational standpoint, which is a couple of verses in Genesis chapter 1. It's the first book of the Bible, in which creation is explained. And you have the text on your screen, but it's absolutely foundational to what we'll be explaining today, because there's a long commentary tradition on this particular passage, which is very relevant to what we're exploring. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And then if we go to the next slide, you will have a reminder of this particular fresco by Michelangelo, which many of you may have seen in the Vatican in Rome, of the creation of Adam. Now, among the most famous images of the Italian Renaissance are the creation of Adam by Michelangelo, and the other item, which was also on the promotional literature, Leonardo da Vinci's depiction of the Homo Universalis, or universal man, the measure or center of all things. The latter has often been misunderstood as suggesting that in the Renaissance, man had become the center of human attention and investigation, almost as if the God-centered view of former centuries had been set completely aside. This would not be quite the case, but it is true that many people who know anything at all about Renaissance philosophy may have come across a quotation of one of its most famous philosophers, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. At the age of 24, this young upstart and extremely learned figure proposed to defend 900 propositions or philosophical theses against all comers in Rome. As part of his preface to these points, he penned a now famous work in which he imagined God after he had made the heavens and the earth. And if we could have the next slide. God took man as a creature of indeterminate nature, and assigning him a place in the middle of the world, addressed him thus: "We have given you, O Adam, no fixed dwelling place or form that is only yours, nor any function peculiar to yourself. This is so that according to your longing or judgment, you may have and possess whatever dwelling place, form, and functions you shall desire. The nature of all other beings is limited and constrained within the bounds of laws we have prescribed. But you are constrained by no limits. Your own free will, which we have given to you, will determine the limits of your nature." Then the next slide. "We have set you at the world's center so that you may from there more easily observe whatever is in the world. We have made you neither of heaven nor of earth, neither mortal nor immortal, so that with freedom of choice and with honor, as though you were the maker and molder of yourself, you may fashion yourself into whatever shape you may prefer. You shall have the power to degenerate into the lower forms of life, which belong to the beasts. You will also have the power out of your own soul's judgment to be reborn into the higher forms, which are divine. After this, Pico goes on to say that man is a being in continual flux, who can become whatever he wishes to become. If he cultivates the vegetative part of himself, he will become like a plant. If he cultivates his sensitive part, he will become like the animals. If he cultivates his rational part, he will grow into a heavenly being. If he cultivates his intellectual and contemplative part, he will become an angel and son of God. In other words, Pico sees man as a chameleon. According to Pico's famous expression, someone who can change into whatever he wishes to. Or to switch metaphors, we can imagine man as being able to occupy various rungs on the ladder of being. He has been placed in the middle between the beasts and the angels. He is able either to descend to the world of mere sensation and greed, or to mount higher to that of light and love. Pico therefore underlines the special place that man has in the universe, and it is little wonder that this work came to be given the title On the Dignity of Man, or Oration on the Dignity of Man. Whether or not this is a fitting title, there's a debate about this. It does not seem wrong to place it, at least partly, within the context of a genre of literature on this topic that saw special growth in the Renaissance. The title of my talk today is borrowed from an important book by the scholar Charles Trinkaus, published in 1970. This is just volume 1 of 2, in which he pointed out some of the themes that were often underlined in the period. This is a quotation from him. He says, he lists man's creation in order to rule over the rest of creation, the beauties and utilities of the world at man's disposal, the capacities of the human mind, soul, and body for the work of ruling the subhuman universe, the erectness of man's posture pointing to his heavenly goal, the immortality of the soul, the gift of the incarnation which divinely honored man, the consequent beatification of man and the resurrection of the body, and man's ascent in dignity beyond the angels. These were the themes that were very often linked to the fact that, according to the account of man's creation in the biblical book of Genesis, as we have seen, God said, "Let us make man in our own image, according to our likeness." In fact, as Trinkaus very rightly points out, these themes were not altogether original. They had already been discussed in part by Neoplatonic philosophers in the first centuries of the Christian era, and they occupied a prominent place in the genuine and pseudographical writings of the Church Fathers. Especially important is Augustine, the Church Father who had something very similar to say in The City of God, Book 12, Chapter 22. We have a reading group in Renaissance Studies on foundational sources for Renaissance studies, and The City of God is a book that we've been going through, so I really thank the members of that group for helping me to think through these issues from the Augustinian perspective. It is also true that these themes have been somewhat muted since Peter Lombard had reflected on them in his famous 12th century commentary on the Scriptures, and it had perhaps become buried within the commentaries on his own work that came afterwards. In any case, there are interesting differences and parallels between what Pico said and the way in which Augustine had presented man's creation and condition. In both cases, strong attention is given to the role of man's will, which can make one choose inferior things rather than superior ones. But whereas the same will in Pico seems to allow one to move upward as well as downward, Augustine presents things slightly differently. If we could have the next slide. God created man's nature to be midway, so to speak, between angels and beasts, in such a way that if he should remain in subjection to his Creator as his true Lord, and with dutiful obedience keep his commandment, he was to pass into the company of the angels, obtaining with no intervening death a blissful immortality that has no limit. But if he should make proud and disobedient use of his free will, live like a beast, at the mercy of death, enthralled by lust and doomed to eternal punishment after death. Here, Augustine seems to make the point that the choice to be had is more between obedience on the one hand and disobedience on the other. In a sense, the faculty of the will is implied in both, but Augustine especially underlines that it is the proud and disobedient use of free will that leads to sin and death. Secondly, in other works, Augustine makes a clear connection between man's condition and the fact that he was created according to the image of God, something he took to relate particularly to three faculties, those of memory, intellect, and will. This is not a particular consideration in Pico, who uses the metaphor of God as an artisan, but strikingly does not say that he stamped his own image on his creation. This may be because Pico does not wish to give the impression that man has a fixed nature, much as a piece of wax would have once impressed with a signet ring. Finally, Augustine gives a much clearer place than Pico to man's relationship with the divine. He is quite clear that although man does have free will, it is not so much thanks to this that he is able to stay close to God, but rather thanks to a burning love and desire for God, instilled and sustained by grace. With Pico, though, it seems to be the force of man's will that allows him to change direction and nature. At a certain point, he seems to suggest that there are various steps involving dedicating oneself to taking care of lower beings. This is the active life. To considering God and his creation. This is the contemplative life. And to becoming full of love. But he is not really explicit about how the process comes about. Some scholars, like Brian Copenhaver, believe that the answer for Pico lies in magic and the Kabbalah, and that this is the true theme of the oration. In other words, the title Oration on the Dignity of Man was attached to the work much later, quite possibly as a marketing ploy. If that is the case, then a more relevant work for our topic is one written by the learned Florentine merchant Giannozzo Manetti around 1452 or 1453. This work, entitled On Human Worth and Excellence, focuses on precisely the topic we are considering today. This work in some sections repeats the views of near contemporaries as well as the church fathers Lactantius and Augustine. Yet here the emphasis on the image of God is not only stronger and clearer, but also receives a particular and very interesting twist. I mentioned earlier that according to Augustine, God's image in man consists of memory, intelligence, or intellect, and will. Manetti discusses all of these, but of special interest is the attention he pays to intelligence. By intelligence, Augustine was referring to man's faculty of reasoning and understanding, the aspect of man that had been used by ancient Greek philosophers such as Aristotle as the surest way of distinguishing people from animals. It was this faculty that was regularly associated with man's special ability to pronounce articulate speech. Manetti, however, does not dwell so much on the speculative aspect that one usually associates with reason, but on a creative, practical, and inventive one. Here, Manetti praises mankind's inventions, such as navigation, and his ability to build and to paint. So he mentions Brunelleschi's dome in Florence. He also mentions Giotto and Ghiberti's doors in Florence, right in front of the main church, the baptistry. Earlier, Manetti had emphasized that man was the only creature to know how to use fire. Later on, Manetti highlights the human intellect as having the quality of the engineer and the artist. This is so much the case that Manetti lists the numerous signs of man's ingenuity or inventiveness, buildings and cities, but also paintings, sculptures, sciences, discoveries, and also all of the different languages and literatures. This aspect of human nature is explicitly tied to the image of God in man, and has been rightly noted as one of the particular contributions of Manetti to the discussion about man's dignity in the Renaissance, something that led artists and literary figures such as Leon Alberti to pick up on it in later years. But there's also a flip side to Manetti's discussion of human dignity. For dignity and excellence can apparently be felt and perceived in the wrong way. Could we have the next slide, please? Sorry, these were the three faculties, and then the next one, yes. From this so great and so sublime dignity and excellence of man, as though from the very root arise and flow not unjustly envy, pride, indignation, lust for domination, and ambition, and other perturbations of the soul of this sort. So, as Trinkhaus acutely observes, man's dignity itself, his honor, is the cause of his sins. For he who dominates others will not brook any superiority over himself, and the result is envy, the desire to dominate, pride, and ambition. So it turns out that although man has great potential for good, he is also fatally flawed. There is the danger that when he understands the exalted position in which he has been placed by God, instead of praising God for it and attaching himself to God, he instead becomes proud and seeks independence and human recognition. These two aspects highlighted by Manetti deserve some comment and tie in powerfully with various aspects that form part of the Christian perspective even today. I mentioned earlier that Manetti emphasizes how God's image in us consists, at least in part, in creative activity. This idea found a home most notably in the classic book by Dorothy Sayers, The Mind of the Maker. First published in 1941, this work built on Sayers' activity as a novelist, playwright, and poet. She was also a translator, among other things, of Dante's Divine Comedy. Sayers maintained that one of the most visible traces of God's image in man is human creativity and artistic gift. The creative imagination, as she called it, exercised by the poet and artist, is able, unlike that, say, of the carpenter, to bring about something out of nothing. Sayers explores this aspect of God and man and how it emerges from the special relationship within the Trinity of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. This is a powerful illustration and helps to counterbalance an exclusively rational interpretation of what intellect or intelligence might mean. It should be said, however, that the biblical account does not specifically say what aspects were meant when God decided to make man in his image and likeness. We might also wonder whether there are other aspects that should be considered specifically human and divine. Some have suggested that laughter may be one of these, or the fact that man was given dominion over the earth. Another candidate that deserves closer scrutiny is our emotional capacity for love, or for feeling the deep suffering of others. Manetti also hints in his description of vices such as envy and pride at the fact that as fallen human beings we no longer bear God's pure image in us. Because man decided to turn against God and disobey his commands at the dawn of time, that image has been marred, and what was good and even perfect has become corrupted. Christian theologians differ in their interpretation of whether all parts of our being, or only certain ones, have been corrupted, and to what extent, by our decision to sin. For instance, is it the case that our memory, intellect, and will have all three become imperfect due to the fall? Do they bear its effects equally? Are there areas in which God's image is still visible in us in its original glory? But what they agree on is that the Christian message is one of hope based on divine grace. As Augustine recognized in his Confessions, we are unable to do anything in and of ourselves to turn to God in our fallen state. Yet we see the mystery that in the person of Jesus Christ, God became man, By his death, the perfect and eternal God took upon himself the weight and penalty of our sin and won immortality for us. The message that Christians wish to share is thus at the same time incredibly encouraging, but also sobering. We are made in God's image and therefore have an exalted status and enormous potential. We are at the peak of creation and in some ways superior to angels. As God's creatures, we are objects of his infinite love. At the same time, our bad decisions have made us proud, rebellious, envious, and sinful. We have turned from God and are on the path to death. The real question we need to confront today is really still the same as in the time of Augustine, Manetti, and Pico. Will we keep both of these aspects of our humanity in mind and turn to God to restore his image in us? Or will we pretend that we are fine as we are, masters of our own fate, with unlimited power and self-sufficiency, and able, as Pico thought, to transform ourselves into angels? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. We are now going to have a short break so you can think about everything we've just heard. And there will be instructions coming up on the screen of how you can send in some questions for the Q&A that we're going to have after you've had 5 minutes to process and chat about what you've just heard. Thank you.